Welcome back, welcome back. Everyone had a little stretch, a little more Florida sunshine. We're closing in on it here. We've got two dynamic sessions that you're not going to want to miss. And it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for our next session, Lieutenant Colonel Mariner. He's currently assigned to the Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy Division. In this capacity, he leads, develops, coordinates, and oversees implementation of national space policy in support of the Secretary of Defense and National Security Council. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Mariner.
Hello? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you for the music. Like the speaker said, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Mariner. Most folks know me as Macho. It's weird. Most folks don't actually know my real name. My call sign is Macho. I got that a couple years ago, and it's just stuck with me ever since. So like the speaker said, I work in the policy division for the Secretary of Defense, under the Under-Secretary of Defense for Policy. And the title of the slide here says, Correcting Common Assumptions Myths About the Role of Policy. So for this audience particularly, as we seek to innovate and seek to push the envelope forward with regards to space operations and activities and responsible activities in space, both from a military perspective or maybe from a private perspective, depending on where you sit, you might have some misconceptions. So I've been in the policy office for about 3 months, and everywhere I've gone, to include here over the course of the last couple of days, by the way, I've been taking notes and names of you all as you've been saying, oh, policy this, policy won't let us do this, policy won't let us do that. Okay, but 9 times out of 10 when I start to question, or those of us from our office start to question, what policy are you speaking about, and who told you that? 1, the policy can't be named, and 2, the person who told you that isn't from a policy organization. So when you hear policy won't let us do X, I would challenge you to question that and dig into what is really stopping you. And 9 times out of 10, the answer was probably nothing. Nothing is stopping you from thinking big thoughts. Nothing is stopping you from trying to press those big thoughts into reality. The bottom line is, if something is technically feasible, we should be able to explore it as an option for our most senior decision makers to then decide on. Because at the end of the day, policy is a decision by the person who has the authority to make said decision. And in our domain, at least for the military, a lot of those decisions reside well above most of our heads, right? They reside with the president or the Secretary of Defense or someone at that level. All right. So, real quick, I have been asked the question of why can't we just get rid of the policy office? The answer is you can't, because it's the law. It is literally written into the law that the Office of Secretary of Defense will be an organization within the Department of Defense. Now, those of us in the military understand the concept of span of control. The Department of Defense is a rather large organization. You have to have span of control to do all of the things that the organization is tasked to do. And policy is one of the ways the Office of the Secretary of Defense is organized to do that. So you see here in Title 10 of the U.S. Code, the function of the office is to assist the Secretary of Defense in carrying out their duties and responsibilities. Those duties and responsibilities associated with the civilian oversight of the military. At the end of the day, the organization is there to achieve efficient administration of the department and effectively execute the authority, direction, and control of the position of the Secretary of Defense. So it's a large organization. Policy is just one rung, okay? There's several undersecretaries. When you think of policy, think idea people. Those are the folks who are examining ideas and deciding a few things about those ideas and pushing that up to the senior leaders to make informed decisions about those ideas. Your comptroller, as you might imagine, is the money people, right? Personnel and readiness are the people. I know that's a little redundant, right? INS, intelligence and security, it's in the name, so on and so forth. But policy, when you think policy, think idea. Also, I will say this is not the only policy organization that exists in the Department of Defense. The Joint Staff has a policy division. The different services have policy divisions, okay? But this is the governing policy division amongst them all for the department. Within that, you have the role. Think about a 21-year-old kid. Like literally, what's at the bottom of this slide is what I go through with my 21-year-old kid when he's trying to make a decision. Should you do that? Can you do that? May you do that? All three of those things have to be answered, right? There's a policy piece, there's a capability piece, and then there's the legal piece, which usually rules the roost, believe it or not. So when people say policy this or that, 9 times out of 10, something comes down to a legal decision, legitimately. And that is the purview of the Office of General Counsel, which is not policy. They are the lawyers. Boo, hiss, right? All right. The OSD policy organization is spread out this way. Space policy is a unique functional area. The red box there, it encapsulates the Assistant Secretary of Defense for space policy, and they do space and missile defense as well as our nuclear and counter weapons of mass destruction policy for the department. However, pay attention to all the other organizations. If you have a policy decision that needs to be changed, for whatever the reason is as it pertains to space operations, most likely that is going to be weighed in on by multiple Assistant Secretaries of Defense. Example, I want to put space capability or a ground station in, Saudi Arabia. Well, space policy is going to have a vote because it's a space capability. But the regional office that is responsible for the Middle East, DASD Middle East, as you're looking at the chart, top left-hand side, first light blue box, they're going to weigh in too because they engage with those Middle East countries to determine whether or not that Middle East country is even willing to entertain the idea of putting some type of capability into their country that is United States owned. Does that make sense? So keep in mind, you will have multiple organizations that get a vote through their lens from a policy perspective. The ASD space policy is further broken up into 4 different teams. So you have a strategy analysis, requirements, operations, and resources, which is where I currently sit, a partnerships team, and then missile defense and defeat is its own unique category because it needs some very, very specific love, if you will. So not only will multiple policy directorates weigh in on what you're trying to achieve and advocate for or against it, multiple teams will work your policy position or your recommended change within each one of those directorates. And this is the fun slide, right? This is how it works. We don't go out and do a whole lot of grunt work. It's a lot of writing, riveting stuff, I know. However, policy, believe it or not, is probably your best friend in the building. This is where you will get your advocacy for what you're trying to do, as long as what you're trying to do is well informed. I will tell you, 90% of, this is my assessment, not the official statistics, so please don't go back and be like, your guy said this and that. Anyway, a lot of things come into the office not fully thought through. From a risk perspective, from a threat-informed perspective, it's, I want delegated authorities. Why? Well, because I want delegated authorities. Cool. That's not going to fly. Like, think it out. Do the homework. It is on you. It is the burden of proof of doing the homework of why this is a good idea and why we should do this and why we should make this change is on the person recommending the change. Does that make sense? It is not on our decision makers to do that homework. It's got to come with the homework attached. So myth busting. There is literally gray space in everything. Okay? We can't have the conversations. We can't advance the policy. We can't make a change if it doesn't get recommended. You can't come into the building with an uninformed position on your recommendation. So do the homework up front, bring it in, and policy, the offices in policy will actually be your best friend because they'll be advocating for your position. They're the ones, this is the organization that will get it up to the decision maker who will make the call, right? So when we say policy won't, well, no, it's the authority, the deciding authority made the call. It wasn't some random person in a policy office. Do not self-limit. In the past 4 months, I've gone to multiple operational planning conferences. I've gone to tactics development conferences. I've listened to a lot of folks in sidebar conversations, some of which were here. Man, it would be really nice if we could do X. Well, what's stopping you? The answer is nothing. Go develop a position. Go do the homework. And then bring your idea for X to the right decision authority. And the policy office will help you do that. Not only will they help you do that, they will help you frame the discussion to the right words to get across to your audience. Timing does matter. So when I say that, it's very important to understand that a no now does not necessarily equate to a no forever. The world changes. Threats change. The position of the United States government changes. Therefore, just because you got to know doesn't mean stop. Doesn't mean put it on the shelf and thou shalt never talk about it again. No, that's not the answer. As a situation arises, be like, man, I had that great idea back then. This would solve that problem that we're seeing today. Go grab it, update the homework, and bring that position back in. And allow the government and the deciders to have all of the options available to them so that they can make the best informed decision when it matters. And that's kind of what that bumper sticker there at the bottom says. All right. So throughout the conference, and I kind of breezed through the slides real quick because I wanted to get to your questions, because throughout the conference there's been a lot of standing up with policy we got to change this policy or that policy, or we got to stop, policy told me no. Cool. If you've got questions about that, ask me right now. If you've got questions about the process, ask me. Let me help you. I'll give you my card when I get off the stage, and we will work out what it is that you're trying to do. I will tell you the process to go through to do it. So, with that, what questions do you have? All right. So, recently, a couple combatant commands, with the stand-up of the component commands, have sought to reorganize command authorities that had inherently either been SecDef authorities, POTUS authorities, or residual in the U.S. Spacecom Combatant Command Commander or the U.S. STRATCOM Combatant Command Commander before that. We have changed the way that works now with the stand-up of component commands and the way the geographic combatant commanders want to see to their forces, particularly space forces that might be deployed into their theater. That has been successful on multiple fronts. And it was successful because the argument came in and it was well thought through. And it makes sense. And it's somewhat aligned with doctrine, but some of it didn't, and now doctrine is changing to adapt to the world we are in today, to adapt to the fact that there's now a U.S. Space Force and a primary service provider to all the combatant commands. Now, my favorite that comes into the building is, I want delegated authorities. I want delegated authorities to do X. And they go, well, why? Why do we have to delegate them? Well, we think, okay, I'm glad you thought about it, but do you have any proof, objective proof, modeling in sim, any outlying situations where the current authority wouldn't work? No. Go do that homework. Go do that homework and tell the current decision authority why they should delegate it, right? That one happens more often than you may think. There are a couple others that have come into the building, particularly from regional offices, where it's a really good idea to do X process. However, that requires a partnership engagement, and that partnership engagement might strain the current mill-to-mill relationship with the country that you're looking to do this with. And because of that, it gets shot down, because now is not the time to strain that particular relationship, given what's going on with their government, given what's going on with our government. That doesn't mean it's not still a good idea. That just means now's not the time for it. We'll just shelve that one until it is time. So those are some examples of successful and not successful and time to take a pause efforts that have come into the building. Any other questions? So on that specific topic, I'm not sure. What I do know is okay, so if I'm tracking your question right, is there any discussion of giving the service, the United States Space Force, authority to operate the spaceports beyond what is currently granted, correct? Okay, within the test range of the space launch capacity. Yes? So, specifically, I'm not tracking, but that doesn't mean that another office or another area of the policy division within the building doesn't have it. But I can find out and get back to you. So I'll get your information after this, and I'll plug you in with the right folks to do that. What I will say is that we are rapidly working on evolving industrial policy and linkages between the military and the industrial complex for the use of space and the development of space capabilities. There's a integrated commercial strategy that was just released, and we are working on a couple other updates to Department of Defense directives, Department of Defense instructions, to codify disparate guidance over the last 10 years because those documents haven't been updated in some time. Other questions?
So we have a mic up here just in case you have a question. Stacy Brooks, I worked with the Space Force, long time space policy history in my career before that. One thing that's mystified me a little bit is when the White House is drafting policy and wants the department's input, how does that get down to the appropriate stakeholders to provide that feedback? It seems to come into space policy or somewhere in your area, but then I don't understand how it rattles down through the building to make sure that the appropriate feedback gets back.
So, like any good answer, the answer is it depends, right? So it depends on what the White House is asking for specifically. But the general way that happens is it either comes from the White House directly or it comes to the National Security Council. And from there, it'll go tasked down to the department, and it'll come to the undersecretary, and then the undersecretary will task out the applicable directorates as they see fit. So most, if not all of that, would at some point trickle down to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for space policy. And then from there, which is currently Mr. John Hill is the person performing the duties of that position because it's a politically appointed position, and I believe it was Mr. Plum who has since vacated that position. So it would come to Mr. Hill, and Mr. Hill would task out to his team that you saw there, and it would go from there. Does that make sense?
Just curious if it then goes into the services or various offices.
So yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if we can't answer it outright because there's a definitive answer right away, it'll get tasked out to the appropriate SMEs from that directorate within the ASD, or the ASD for space, or Assistant Secretary of Defense for space.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What I will say is, Well, just to follow up on that last piece, real quick. The U.S. Space Force is still new, right? The department is still figuring out when it is most appropriate to task that service with specific things out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, be that policy, comptroller, whatever, right? So that is something to keep in mind. Man.
Thank you for joining us at the Space Force Power Conference. I'm Lena Cashin from the Aerospace Corporation. I wanted to know, since the establishment or reestablishment of the National Space Council, what priorities have they pushed down to OSD and specifically OSD policy that you're trying to either implement or things that you're working on?
So, good question. I'm glad you asked, because there is a misunderstanding of the difference between the National Security Council and the National Space Council. So the National Security Council has the ability to engage, obviously the Secretary of Defense is a principal member, and tasking to the department can come from the National Security Council through the Secretary down to the department. The National Space Council does not necessarily have that authority to set the priorities for the department. The National Space Council can engage with the National Security Council. They can engage with the Secretary. They can engage with the organization and say, we would like X, but they don't have the authority to demand or redirect the priorities or resources of the department. That is the distinct purview of the Secretary of Defense through that chain of command. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So you may get double teamed here. Bruce McClintock from the RAND Corporation. I'm going to follow up on Lena's question about that, because this is one of the things that troubles allies in dealing with the United States, is we can't get our own story straight, candidly. Let me put it this way. We did a report called Allied by Design a few years ago. Allies don't know who to talk to in the United States when it comes to not just policy, but resourcing, FMS, et cetera. On your comment about National Space Council, National Security Council, mostly true, but National Space Council published the space policy directives that provided direction to the United States government across the board, to include DoD. So that was a National Space Council product. The council itself can't direct you. How do we get our own story straight so that our allies and partners in commercial are comfortable talking to us and they know who the right people to come to talk to are on any topic? So pretty broad question, but back to you.
So there's a couple different ways to engage, but as far as the position of the United States writ large as a government, right, that's a question for the current presidential administration, and when that changes, as that changes for the United States, right? So the Department of Defense, nor can I or anyone in space policy really answer that question, because that's a bigger question for really the POTUS. Does that make sense? So with regards to that, how can we get our story straight? I mean, we'll have to take that up with that level of government. With regards to how to engage, though, through and to the military, it's all through the Department of Defense. Like, that is the point of entry when talking military space. When talking commercial or research space, right? You're talking NASA, maybe some of the other organizations that do that. But if you're talking military, it's the Department of Defense. That's your point of entry. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Macho, I'm Dan, also from RAND. That wasn't coordinated. Different question. I've heard in a lot of environments there's a distinction between authorities and permissions. Could you share your thoughts on that distinction? And second, how does OSD policy think about our contingency plans? For example, when we, as a department, have planned for the need for, let's say, an authority for Spacecom to do something, when we have indications and warnings that the plan's going to need to be activated. So a future authority, if you will. How does policy think through that?
Okay. So first question was the difference between authorities and permissions, right? So authorities are a purview that dictate who gets to make a decision, right? That is the authority. I have the authority to say you can or cannot do something, right? Permissions, they're kind of the same thing, right? Because framing permissions is a little different, but kind of the same, if that makes sense, right? So while you have permission to make it, what is driving you to make that at that time and granting in time and space the latitude to make said decision. I know that's a little confusing, but the bottom line is the authority is a codified responsibility to make a certain set of decisions, whereas permission is more of a time and space and latitude to make that decision kind of question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in our research, we've heard a lot that you can have the authority to do something, but not necessarily the permission. So when you say time, space, and latitude to do something you have the authority to do, who is the person that provides said permissions to do that? Is it the person that grants the authority that would then subsequently grant the permission?
Yes. So the second question was about O-plans. How does the department think through planning?
No, it's really not asking you to regurgitate the joint planning process, but
Yep.
to think through the contingency plans, you got a plan on the shelf to do something in the future, given certain conditions, and that plan requires an authority to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Does policy think through authorities like that for a specific plan in the same way as you do for authorities that are needed for campaigning, like Time Now?
Absolutely. So policy, so one of my portfolios is actually planning. So I show up to a lot of joint and combined planning conferences where they're building plan for X contingency or whatever. And as we go through the different options that they would like to put in the plan, right? The different forces they would like to use to achieve whatever the effects the plan is directing. We talk through the authorities to use those capabilities, when those authorities would need to be granted to whatever level of command we believe is appropriate, and then we bake that into the plan. And then that plan goes through a review and approval process all the way up to the secretary, so that everyone in the chain is informed of, at this point, these would be the decisions we would need to make, these are the people who would need to make them, and this is the timeline we would need to make them on. And then as the nuance of the situation unfolds and you pull that plan off the shelf, that might alter a little bit, but you have basically the 90% solution. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, and I'll just leave with a comment, right? You talked about the timing needed to make said decision, and right, that often seems to be the point of tension. Right, let's say Spacecom, since we're at a Spacepower workshop here.
Mm-hmm.
Spacecom needs to do some classified space activity one day after the plan is activated, but we know getting permission to do said activity probably would take more than a day of coordination. So there's a tension in the ability of Spacecom to execute the plan that the Joint Planning Committee says is needed to achieve certain conditions that are agreed upon by policy. So the tension between timing and the ability to get permission to do that activity in a realistic fashion.
So I would say it's a potential tension, because as plans go through the wargaming process, things like that get brought to the surface. And at which time, this is all part of doing that homework we were talking about, right? Wargame the plan out, figure out what the tension points are, bring that to the surface, and get that to the authority as the plan's being developed to go, this isn't going to work, we wargamed it, here's the proof, this is what we really need, yes or no, boss, right? So that's all part of doing that homework, so that when that plan goes on the shelf, it's executable, it's viable, and everybody knows what is going to need to be decided and when.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Macho, to General McClintock's point, can you talk a little bit about how we get our story straight through consistent strategic messaging?
Yes. So all of those organizations that I put up there before, let's see. So even within ASD space policy, right, when we talk about especially integrating with partners and allies, you see a partnerships team there. We understand that we can't do space without our allies and partners. That's why there's a partnerships team as part of the Assistant Secretary for Space, specifically to address those types of things. And then within bigger policy, where all the assistant secretaries are living, you have the regional offices. We are coordinating across all of those teams, all of those offices to get our story straight when we take something to our allies and partners. When they want to come engage with us, let's say a country in Africa is interested in becoming a spacefaring nation as a military component or a military entity and a spacefaring nation. They could enter through the partnerships that they have with the Department of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Africa, or they could enter through the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy because they want to talk about space. At which time, whichever entering point they come to, those organizations are going to start to coordinate across the department so that all of the organizations with some type of equity in that partnership will be engaged, and we can have a singular story with our partners and allies. Again, this is from the military standpoint in the Department of Defense. This is not for the United States government writ large and how we engage through the State Department. They have a different set of processes. And oh, by the way, yes, the Department of Defense does coordinate interagency with the State Department and Treasury as needed to do those types of messaging events and engagements. All right. If you have more questions, I'm going to de-mic. I'm going to come out over there. You can, one more?
I have a question, Macho.
Yeah.
Are there any upcoming or recently published space policies that we should be watching out for, and where can we access and read through those?
So, yes, there is a NIPR site where you can pull down documents from the Department of Defense at the OSD level. There's also sites on classified for those that are classified. There are a few that are coming out. There are new DoD instructions with regards to space operations. The 3100.10 will be coming out. The 3100.15 is going through a rewrite right now. There's a 3100.GI or guidance and intent memo that deals with rendezvous and proximity operations that'll be coming out soon. There's the newest, like I said, the newest integrated commercial space strategy that was just released. I believe it was last year. So if you need that information, contact me here at this email address, and I will get you in contact with the right person or place to find the policy documentation you're looking for. All right, and with that, that's my time. Oh, you got to write fast, baby. That's why we got phones in here taking pictures. Clickety clack. It worked. We good? All right. All right. Thank you.